Welcome. My name is David Black. Thanks for sharing your Saturday afternoon with me. I'm going to be discussing a randomized controlled trial that is completed in its stage of recruitment, enrollment, and analysis, but that we're still examining outcomes and papers and methodologies. So I'll share with you what I have so far and make it a nice bridging between science and practice, so I don't go too heavy into technical talk. And also, I'm going to be sharing with you a format, I'll go back to this, that I'd like to take today, given that it is later in the day. Maybe we'll go this way. I'll talk for 20 minutes. We'll have a couple minutes for questions. I'll talk for another 20 minutes, and we'll have some more time for questions. Because I was noticing as I was going through other talks today, by the time you're getting to the end of a talk and trying to write things down quickly, it might be harder. Maybe this will allow us to have a little bit better discussion. So please, if you feel compelled to write a question, please add it at any time, and we'll try to get to it midway through. So my objectives today are to talk about the utility of using a program that includes mindfulness in the treatment of an addiction. Here specifically a substance use addiction, which is differentiated from other types of addictions like behavioral addictions. And examine the trial methods that we use, because this was in a complex living on-site residential treatment center. So there's a lot of complexity with running trials in that format. So there's some interesting methodology to discuss here. And then look at the results for our main outcomes. One being site retention, which was this really unique outcome that I hope you find interesting. And the more common outcome, which is the substance use behavior itself, defined as relapse and count of use and frequency of use. And then the limitations of this type of study, the limitations of what we've learned about using mindfulness in the sample, and where we might go. And there's that format I mentioned. So just a brief introduction about substance addiction. By definition, it's the use of substances that becomes compulsive and continues despite harmful consequences. So differ, say, from recreational use or from non-addictive use, where the person is used but has no more interest in using, or it's not impacting their life. There's some important features here that have to do with substance addiction, which is we formulate habits, right? It becomes a part of our life, and often in response to some type of trigger or urge. Tolerance is important, so there's usually a requirement to take a higher dose of a substance to gain similar effects over time. Withdrawal symptoms are those discomforts experienced when you stop taking the drug at the level required to keep a physiological homeostasis. And then also cycles of relapse and remission, where the user recognizes that there may be an issue that's a problem in their life. They try to quit. Others see them actively attempting to quit usually. And then a relapse occurring where they fall back into the behavior and the habit formation. And in terms of linking this to mindfulness training, I think the statement that I would like to make is that addiction steals and preoccupies a person's attention. Now, why does it do that? There's a lot of time, energy, and space spent on obtaining the substance to be used, thinking about the substance, dealing with cravings surrounding the substance, encountering withdrawal symptoms. And all of these things require a substantial amount of an individual's attention, and using it in a way where it's really directed to external stimulus and finding drugs and substances in an environment, and then attention to what a person should do with the drug, who they should do it with, and how to acquire it. So a significant amount of attention is used up. And what we're trying to do when we encounter people who have an addiction problem or have been mandated to treatment because of addiction and problems with use, what we're trying to do underlying our message in mindfulness training is to reclaim some of that attention. And I love the definition of reclaim here, because it's the act of recovering a thing through cultivation. And I think that's exactly what we're trying to do in our mindfulness program, specifically that attentional feature. To grasp that attention, to bring it to current state awareness, and to utilize it in ways that could prevent use. And so why would you need something like a mindfulness program in residential treatment? Well, there's a lot going on in residential treatment. It's usually in residence, so you have to imagine you're living in a new situation. You're living with peers that may not necessarily be a great fit with you. You're dealing with your withdrawal symptoms and experiencing cravings and urges to use in the context of interpersonal conflict and other conflicts. Most of the people in our trial, which were all women, and we'll get into them, were having external family problems, social relationship problems with spouses, with partners, with their children. And they're also simultaneously, with all of these things going on, processing intensive daily therapy. So day-to-day therapies, usually cognitive behavioral therapies, social support services, and group-based therapies as their new routine. And you can imagine processing all these things with other people has its discomforts. And they're also navigating systems like jail systems and prisons, which they often were in and out of jail and prison systems prior to entering the residential program. And they're also trying to manage their relationships with their children as they're on different sites now, and typically grandparents and government agents would be managing their child at this point. So you can imagine the discomfort and the stress and probably the dislike of being in a place here, even though you know you're getting treatment, wanting to get out. And that's usually the main issue for residential treatment. It is the early leave. And we definitely know the strong correlation between leaving treatment early and lack of successful recovery. Recovery itself is nearly impossible in terms of treatment outcomes and efficacy, but people can reduce their use and people can abstain. The trouble is keeping them in treatment, and the longer we can, the better the outcome. So what are we trying to do? What do the clients need typically in this type of treatment setting? Well, you have to address the issues with suffering, right? This is a chronic relapsing condition. The anxieties that could surround something like that, the concerns for the future, when someone is in remission and worrying about their future use once they get out, and the impacts on their family. These are all things that need to be addressed. Managing on the site, the use, the withdrawal, the craving, and relapse cycles. You often see people enter the programs, deal with withdrawal symptoms, get out at a pretty successful rate, then experience craving, their old social groups, and face relapse cycles, and may return to inpatient care or fit within the legal system. So we need to address all of those things as expectations in treatment to try to prevent those cycles from persisting as they leave, addressing distress and emotional states that arise from the symptoms themselves, during periods of not using, the new realizations that occur of the damage done to families and friends and groups that the person previously had in their network. They're coping with triggers and residential living challenges. As I mentioned, these aren't easy. They're new people. You're living with them, and with any roommate, there are challenges. And imagine all your roommates also going through intensive psychotherapies when they're not at their best at this point in their life. So they also need social support, family support, vocational support, and legal services. So those are the things, not necessarily that adding a mindfulness program would do, but that in the milieu of services being provided at intensive residential treatment, these are all the things that they're getting exposed to. So the support structure is there, but the goal that for adding a mindfulness-based program was to keep them at the residential site, knowing that drop off and drop out of treatment is so prevalent. So what was the conceptualization of the program? Well, this was bringing together Hortensia Morrow, who had training in trauma and expertise in understanding trauma in the lives of women, especially in the context of families and sexual trauma, and integrating that expertise with Zaria Vallejo, who is an MBSR certified teacher, working especially with Spanish-speaking communities and in minority groups, to try to build a program. And this was kind of going on simultaneously to other programs that ultimately were developed and published sooner, like mindfulness-based relapse prevention, and there are similar aspects to these programs, to be delivered in a different way, which is in substance use disorder treatment, residential in particular, which no program had yet been developed for, to address the needs of women on site. Typically, the mindfulness-based stress reduction, an MBRP derivative of that was intended for aftercare. So after all these intensive services were met that I had discussed, but we argued that perhaps there was something in service that was needed, given that so many women drop out. Like, could we support their stress management, their mindfulness skills, their non-reactivity, and other things, so they would stay in the treatment to get these services as long as possible. So the focus is on residential recovery and residential living. It adapts for the literacy needs of women. The education level is not high, often on, the most average person having high school or lower, having trauma history. That was a special emphasis in this manual, noting that certain practices in the original development of the mindfulness-based stress reduction program, like the body scan, had complications when you're dealing with a group exposed to high levels of trauma, especially sexual trauma. So the teachers that we use had to be highly trained and experienced in trauma and addictions therapy to understand the triggers and the previous life exposures that would make these women uncomfortable with doing some of those activities. It focused on the interpersonal conflicts and the use of the mindfulness training and practices that can be applied to the dorm life interpersonal conflict, practices assigned to parenting roles, the guilt that was felt, the attention without reactivity to perceive failure in their lives as parents, and also cultural and language differences, where the women were instructed that they can reimagine the practices from various types of languaging, such as the raisin exercise that can be considered other types of foods, and other types of practices where languages needed to be concrete in the cultural understanding of these women based on where they were from and the way they perceived the world. And the timing also had to be shifted itself. So this was 2 times per week for 80 minutes each session across 12 sessions. So it was 6 weeks in total. There was no full day retreat given the complexities of the treatment site. To be able to go 6 to 8 hours just dedicated to this program was unrealistic. So we extended the number of sessions, which typically are 8, and we made it more intensive to fit the more intensive nature of the treatment site and the more routine meetings that happen per week. So here is the treatment manual, and you can make a request for this if you want to email me, and I'm happy to send this to you. Now we're talking about integrative medicine here, and what we're doing is integrating treatment. So conventionally, you're going to get a lot of cognitive behavioral approaches at a site like this. They were not currently using any meditation type practices on a formal basis. And so what they're getting is all those services programs that I mentioned, legal, social, and family, and the focus being on cognitive behavioral therapy, in particular relapse prevention. And what does that focus on? Well, talk therapy, verbalizing emotional states, verbalizing issues around triggers, about urges, gaining feedback in a dynamic group-based or individual-based setting where you can talk about emotions and thoughts, and someone will help you reorganize that into a pattern that's more sufficient to help this person deal with their cravings or other challenges in their life. It's also identifying and preventing high-risk situations. So there's a lot of discussion about setting up scenarios and practicing scenarios where a problem may occur that could lead to use, and working around and building communication skills to prevent that use, and avoiding those triggers and experiences of any experience to prevent urges. So in a way, you're trying to stay away from the features that would be guiding a potential relapse. And strategies used would be like thought stopping. So recognizing obsessive thoughts over a substance when in a state of craving, and distracting oneself, or providing active problem like writing out the features of a day where you can pretty much avoid any thinking or action in substance use. And there is some efficacy there. And there's been efficacy on this other side, which I'm calling this the integrating of treatments, because what the mindfulness-based practices offer are more of an experiential approach and meditation. And what do you do in that context? It's a form of attention training. So you're building awareness of the fluctuating sensory states. So not necessarily verbalizing them, not necessarily elaborating, but being aware of those states and identifying verbally, but observing at that place and not taking that farther. You're not trying to reorganize the thoughts, repattern, or gain new insights about them. You're just trying not to react. So you can see states passing without reactivity in a state of relaxation. And that's where the meditation practices and our very light yoga, which we can probably just call body posturing and very gentle poses with our group, because we didn't want to extend this to a more complex yoga program. So some women in our groups found it better that lying on their backs or a very light stretch with one leg over the other and stretching the lower back really got them in the attentional space that they can sustain without being overwhelmed by thought and emotion. So we use very light yoga practices. And the other feature is decentering. Rather than trying to stop the process of thoughts, you can see these by decentering and realizing that the thoughts were not actually concrete as a defining element of the person, and also building emotional states, which is noticing a sense of neutrality, that you can get to a state where you feel balanced, and you can also start building from that space, building states of kindness, compassion towards other, and compassion also to previous behavior when people are facing lots of guilt about things that have made their connection to their use to their family, for example. So as therapeutic targets in this program, talking about the trial now, we thought that, hey, if we can use this 12-session program to cultivate mindfulness skills through meditation practice and mindfulness stretching, basically, we can foster distress tolerance, so how much someone can tolerate uncomfortable states, gain a sense of effective balance. So emotions weren't wildly high and low. Someone could see that there could be some neutral states, and you can build in some salient emotions like kindness that can be stable and non-threatening. Emotion regulation, so when knowing you're in a state of craving or you're feeling a sense of urge, to feel that you have more power over it. And then just surfing urges themselves, and this term has been around for a while, that someone who's used previously and is facing an urge, they could see over time, if they watch without reactivity, it will subside without destroying them. And this has often been called or referred to as surfing the urge or riding the wave of use. And so what would be the outcome here? Well, in our study, we wanted to look at two important outcomes. The typical outcome was the use, so alcohol and drug use and relapse. So did they return in a setting that is asking these women to be abstinent because the use has been highly problematic in their life, and they're getting a bunch of social services and therapeutic services that they can go forward, successfully complete treatment, and then not use. That would be the ultimate goal. And that has been what other studies have looked at. A unique and novel element of this study was to examine site retention and therapeutic progress, because this is what seems to be even more essential, is to, given that there are limitations in being able to completely stop use over the life course, can we keep people in therapy as long as possible, given that it's really uncomfortable to be in therapy and that a lot of people drop off? So we thought that was a really important outcome to look at. And I'll finish out here with the study hypotheses, and then I'll open this up for our first set of questions now that we're at the 20-minute mark. So what we looked to do and to test was by adding this program to substance use disorder residential treatment. So this is an add-on. And then we're actually going to have a control group. And this is like drug risk psychoeducation. So it teaches them a lot about the effects of drugs on the brain. So it's an educational piece. And also I would call it fear-inspired learning once the participants learn about the major effects that substance use can have on the brain function, and memory. Maybe that would also be effective in some ways. So that was our control. Our goal was to test for the improvement of retention and residential treatment, reduce substance relapse and use amount, see if there are actually those therapeutic targets that change, which I mentioned. Like, are we actually changing what we think or what we believe the program would target? What the trial also did was explore some functional brain activity. Now I'll show you some baseline information that is informative about the sample, but I won't be presenting on the group differences on brain activity at this point. Okay, so here was the design of the study. This is a parallel group, so meaning that women who are eligible for the trial are either assigned to one of two conditions, and I just outlined the condition. It would be their normal treatment, or they get the moment by moment and women's recovery program, which is the mindfulness training program, or they would get the neurobiology of addiction program. So that's the one where I told you it's about the effect of substances on the brain, on neurology, on memory, and all of these things. This is a trial funded by the National Institutes of Health, NIDA, and NIAAA. There's the trial number if you want to go and read more about it. And these were adult women. So this is an all women's treatment site. They're diagnosed with substance use disorder. So it's a clinical diagnosis at entry for alcohol and or drug abuse. It's publicly funded. Our assessments were at baseline prior to our program development and prior to our intervention phase. 6 weeks was the length of the program, as I mentioned, so immediately after that, and following them for 8.5 months from when they started that treatment, the first treatment date. So this was an extensive follow period, and we had a lot of data. We have 8 months of daily substance use data leading into the trial. There's substance use data during the period in which we're in the treatment, and then 8.5 months from the start of when our intervention began. So we have a ton of information about daily substance use data, and this can be compiled in a lot of ways and also gives us a lot of opportunities to analyze data. They're also given, in the intervention, both groups were given a practice device just to know how we were trying to reinforce from both groups. They were everyone was given an MP3 player to keep, and on there was either, I think about 10 to 15 minutes a day of mindfulness practice exercises, or 10 to 15 minutes a day of educational material of neurobiology of addiction. So they were given this as daily reinforcements to either practice the mindfulness arm or to learn new information so we can heighten exposure to our program. We examined fidelity. So did we implement the program, both treatments, as they are intended to be implemented? So how do you assess something like this? Well, all study groups were audio recorded. And because it's a lot of work to review all of these, what you would typically do is get some raters who are trained to understand content and listen to how teachers are delivering the material. And then what we did was a random selection of 50% of the group sessions per cohort to represent the overall sample selected. We used adherence and competence scales, and it appears from this approach, what is available in the examination of fidelity, we had strong adherence to the curriculum, on average almost 2 out of 2 in both conditions, and teacher competence in both conditions. So we wanted to make sure that both were being delivered as we intended they be delivered. And I wanted to point out, because it has so much practical value, my PhD student, Afton Kechter, was the lead on developing what we conceptualized after this trial as key elements in fidelity. So how you design the test of the hypotheses, how you train, how you deliver the program, how your participants receive it, and how they enact the skill that you're asking them to act. So if you're interested in seeing really intervention intensive information about Fidelity, we produced a report from the trial here about how to make your own assessments. Our outcome measures in the trial were retention. And so how do you assess retention? This was a complicated measure because we wanted it to be super valid. So we used clinical chart record. So this is the therapist or the counselor keeping record of how the client is doing. And from this, we can get two important pieces of information. One, days to discharge. So just how many days were they at the center until discharge? And then also a second important piece, the discharge status. So we have the days, but then when they were discharged ultimately, at what status were they at clinically? Did they complete treatment, which means they basically completed all of their treatment goals, and the site thought that they had made sufficient progress to move out of treatment and perhaps go to an outpatient program or less intensive program? Then we have those who left early. They didn't complete all of their clinical goals, but they were making progress along a continuum. Then there were non-completers without any progress. And of course, those would be conceptualized as the most vulnerable. They came into an intensive site, did not make any progress, and they left. So we figured out a way to model all of that simultaneously in a way that was informative. So we want to keep them at the site. And we also want to examine their relapse. So did they use again? What was the time of abstinence until they used again? And if they did use, how frequently were they using? So we used a very conventional measure for this, the timeline follow back. It allows you to basically use a calendar to get days of use on every single day during a specific time span. And as I mentioned, we had 8 months before the trial, during the treatment period, followed out through 8.5 months. And this includes illicit drugs, marijuana, which we have to remember is legal in the state of California, so legal use, and alcohol to intoxication, not just alcohol use. They have to have stated on that day they used until they were intoxicated. And here's the flow through the trial. It's common to assess how participants moved through a trial so you can notice any problems that may have occurred. So we had 367 assessed, 225 were randomized. A trial adaptation was making sure that the women attended a first session. And that's why ultimately enrolled are 100 in each group, because women had to attend a first session to participate. It was the orientation session. Then we have our immediate post-test in the 8.5 months. We had a really good retention for this vulnerable population, 87% and 93% across treatment arms. And then we analyze all available data and intent to treat analysis. So you probably want to know about some sample characteristics. This group really had some complications historically. And we can understand why entering residential treatment leads you to be working with a vulnerable group. So I'll give you some descriptives first and then give a reason to why I said that. So this is on average 33 years old. If you look in the far right column, 58% Hispanic or Latina, about 20% non-Hispanic Black, about 21% non-Hispanic white. So race ethnicity was really diverse. The diagnosis at entry, about 10% had alcohol use disorder only, 73% had drug use only, and 16% had both. Mental health diagnoses. So are there comorbidities that make this population vulnerable and complex when you're trying to deliver interventions? Well, yes, beyond substance use disorder, 47% had a mental health disorder, and then 18% had 2 or more additional mental health disorders, primarily being in post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, I said this sample, remember, the trauma aspect is important, and that was an important finding. And integration and the development of the MMWR program, understanding that women in treatment usually have historical and recent traumas. Here, adulthood trauma, sexual trauma, and physical trauma, all over 70% of the sample. And then an important feature is being mandated. This shows the engagement with legal systems, so the criminal justice system, that they've been mandated to come to the intensive treatment, 48%, child and family services, 34%, and the non-mandated was the minority at 18%. So you can see the complexities that are in the backdrop of working with this population and indicating many needs. Some other interesting characteristics would just be to know from our data, how did these women enter treatment? And then we may know something about their uptake of programs. And this is an understudied area that I hope we can build on. And this is one of the PhD students I mentored, Matthew Multack, and we're still working on this. It's the entry. What does drug use and substance use and alcohol to intoxication look like as women enter treatment? Because we had those 8 months of data. And we can see here that we have, for example, low stable. So those aren't who are not using on a high proportion of days. We see multiple groups having high use that are declining into treatment, and then like a moderate level of use. So the people which we see in treatment may be coming to us with very different drug use trajectories. And why does that have any relevance? Well, because if we examine baseline functioning, and those were latent classes that we modeled, basically what does the data tell us about different trajectories and then how people fit in those trajectories. So if we model those trajectories and associate them with their baseline status, like a 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire, this is someone's mindful, like attentional factors and features that we often measure in mindfulness programs is indicating that someone is progressing in training. And what we find, if you're in that low stable group, so you're not using a lot of drugs over time versus the high stable group, you have a depletion in those capacities if you're using a lot, right? And we find the same thing for difficulties in emotion regulation and mood scores. So this tells us we have users, our sample are people with substance use disorder, and given the trajectory entering treatment, some of these things may be lacking. So it may be a great treatment, a mindfulness program for them, because it targets exactly on perhaps what is lacking in those who are most vulnerable. But it might also provide problems because maybe these things are lacking to a degree where they are challenging to build. And I want to exemplify that point even more here. So I told you we're going to show you some baseline brain function and linking some of the concepts and reasons for developing the program. This was a baseline sample of 43 because we couldn't do imaging on everybody. So we did a subsample. And as you remember, 70% of our sample reported sexual trauma and 30% had PTSD. And so we wanted to look, okay, if this is an important characteristic that may show differential effects, perhaps on where people start in their treatment process or how they can uptake treatment, let's look at networks in the brain that are linked to what we try to do in mindfulness training. So again, this is a project led by a PhD student, Tasha Papa, and working with John Monterosso in finding how trauma is linked with the OFC network, the orbital frontal cortex, and especially, and I don't want to get too technical, basically the regions of connectivity that allow us to attend to sensations of breath and body, which is often what we ask participants to do. This is called interoception. So even in the early classes, either focus on the internal state of taste, of what your attention is landing on awareness itself, usually embodied somewhere. And this is exactly what we're asking people to do. But what is the problem here? Well, we found this, and it was pretty striking, that when we ask people, when they pay attention to their breath on an interoceptive level versus the external world, we found that trauma was relevant and PTSD was also relevant. So if you look at the figure on the right, The left showed brain regions that were affected, and also the endorsement of sexual violence items at an inverse correlation with the network strength. So the more exposure to trauma, the less network strength. And our sample had a high prevalence of women who had this type of history. It tells us something important once again. Oh, we are asking them to do something which requires neural activity, which may have a deficit. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Maybe we're going to build on it, or maybe it's a challenge that would require something else before we build on it. We weren't able to answer that question, but this begs a whole bunch of questions about how we approach therapies and when people are ready for therapies. Okay, so to return to the actual trial results, this is the retention result. So this was more of the primary outcome. So we assessed 150 days after they started our intervention. And I like this breakdown because it shows you the count of completers in residence, non-completers without progress, with progress, and non-completers without progress. So you have 43 completers in MMWR, 31 completers in the control group. And people in residence means that they were still there, still at the treatment site. Non-completers with progress, there were 16 in the MMWR group, 10 in the controls, and without progress, 26 in MMWR and 32 in control. So if you examine that overall, you get a hazard ratio of 0.42, which is a medium effect size in a behavioral trial. So it was impressive. The significance value, with the sample of 200 and the complexity of this outcome, I don't know if we want to rely on it too much. I would prefer to look at the potential effect size here. So that was an interesting finding that those that were in the MMR program were basically spent more time in treatment while making success. I think that's the shorthand interpretation there. And here are the relapse results. So this was survival analysis for time to first use by group during and after intervention. So for people who like statistics, this is a piecewise model that examines survival curves during the intervention period and after. It's probably most important to look at after the people have received an exposure. But we broke it up to make our model more robust and to capture both slopes. So if you look at the drugs, any drug use, meth and methamphetamine use, or methamphetamines or other amphetamines, marijuana and alcohol to intoxication, all the direction of effect means that these women were less likely to use over time, or basically the abstinence period was longer. We only find a significant, statistically significant effect for marijuana, the hazard ratio being 0.44. So that is of medium effect size, and that was statistically significant. In terms of the therapeutic target, so did we change the mechanisms that we thought would change? And this became a complicated question because if we look across the board and don't hurt your eyes too much, that second column at post-intervention, you'll see things like the FFMQ, which is mindfulness skills, stress levels, emotion regulation, affect, distress, and craving. They almost all went in the direction of benefit. So in terms of therapeutic targets, there was no group difference. So MMWR didn't outperform, but within subjects is telling us that overall these women are improving on these features, but it is not the MMWR program that outperformed. So when we looked a little bit more closely at this, because you would probably argue once you thought about it, wow, they are getting a lot of services and this is an add-on, and that makes a lot of sense. if they're going to other cognitive behavioral therapies, if they're getting group services, social services, legal services, and to feel that support network and to be living with other people going through a common situation, many of these things are probably improving on the whole for the entire in-residence sample. So that one was a little harder to detect. So when we looked at it a little bit more closely and said, okay, well, let's look at the change in these things in relation to how much dose that they got of class attendance. So that means they showed up, and so they were exposed and they were developing skills. And we found that only in the MMWR class, so the attendance was correlated with improved mindfulness. So these are large correlations, 0.61, distress tolerance, and positive affect. So this is the correlation of change in these measures with class attendance. And none of this was found in the control group, which was interesting because they all are improving overall, which says something about the therapeutic process, but only in the mindfulness group did they change on these things. So the story is nuanced. In terms of a direct effect, it wasn't there, but it's telling us maybe that at least the dosage and exposure to the program is where the effects are driven. So here are the conclusions. We have to remember this is as part of a milieu of therapy. So given the intensive therapies and support services that are ongoing in these women's lives as part of intensive residential treatment, the program, the MMWR program, compared to control, appears to support site retention with clinical progress. You saw the count on that with a medium effect size. And specifically for substances, the reduction of marijuana, and remember this is legal in the state of California, so the access to it begs an interesting question. So if it was more accessible, so it was the drug that could be used, we find that actually increased the time of abstinence among those people in MMWR. A lot of potentially interesting interpretations can be had here. So the use of marijuana as like a stress alleviating substance, perhaps it wasn't needed for that anymore, or for other coping reasons that people use for mood, anxiety, and other types of challenges. So perhaps for what we may call less addictive features or less addictive substances, maybe women were able to regulate use due to the program and whatever skills that they learned. And there were medium-sized effects, both for retention and marijuana use. What we find is that the target mechanisms remain unclear. So it seems that if there's intensive therapies going on, a lot of psychological measures will bear out and show improvement, but you'll only detect those type of effects, it seems, at least in this trial, with all of these therapies in the background, by examining a dosage parameter, something like attendance, so you know how much a person is getting, and then the relationship to a psychological change. So session attendance appears important. This tells us something about adherence in our programs, trying to bolster practice with things like the MP3 players that we use. So further investigation on how much is required to get what we may consider therapeutic relevance for these substance use outcomes and retention is important. So what are some lessons learned and some limitations? Well, we do have this control group, which we thought was important. It's not a valid in terms of empirical therapy, but it's a psychoeducation, and it targets, I think, important features of what may dissuade people from use. So knowledge about how use impacts brain function, especially when we are, I think, one of the most essential features or impactful features were the images shown of long-term consequences of use, and we got feedback from our sample saying, wow, that had a real impact on me to see that you actually change and make alterations in the brain. So perhaps that was an effective method to prevent some types of use. And we also have to reconsider like the power of these types of studies. You know, having a sample of 200 in the context of a lot of treatments ongoing in the background, if we're looking for smaller effects, we probably are going to need adequate samples, maybe larger. And also considering the social and legal complexities. So you definitely need randomized controlled designs because if there are so many covariates that could potentially impact people's use parameters and use behavior. So to make sure that you're using random design, so the legal complexities, the social complexities, the family problems are equally assigned to both groups. And you can also do some a priori setups to make sure you test for some of those things to see their relevance on substance use. So we didn't find any of that. The baseline equivalencies were good, so we made sure and examined that. The lack of empirical support for therapeutic targets, we mentioned that, and maybe they are the wrong targets. Maybe there was something along the lines, and some studies have began doing this, has been included in some studies like Therapeutic Alliance, where it's the perception that their engagement in the therapeutic process is valuable, important. Maybe we shifted that and we should have paid more attention there. Maybe these classic psychological features are not the ones in this specific context as so many therapies are being delivered during someone's recovery. So this is going to take some thinking through also. And also what we learned, importantly from the study, are these baseline brain and cognitive functions, right? These people have been diagnosed with substance use disorder. And if we look at the profiles, many of them have been heavy users for quite a while. Now, compared to those who weren't using as much, there's some cognitive functional limitations. And what does that mean? So future work can look at these as like either selecting out based on these features and assigning them to groups, interviewing people who have these features about what they most respond to, or other types of study designs where we can learn about when and how to best deliver a mindfulness programs and any type of program for that purpose, to address these issues, these limitations of people perhaps not being able to participate in the interoceptive features that we're asking them to in mindfulness training. That finding in particular, the ability for the brain to have high connectivity when you're examining sensory states like we do in mindfulness training, if that's depleted, I'm not sure exactly what we're doing when we're asking people to participate in some of these practices. Or maybe we are starting at a baseline level and we are really building it over time where the most vulnerable could benefit the most. So, and what's in the future? You know, considering that substances may lead humans to be problematic in their use of substances. So the substances themselves aren't the problem, it's people's use and dependence and the way it integrates and creates problems in their life. We are examining substances from a different lens, and I think this connects well to the overall conference here on integrative medicine, that treatment programs are being developed to start integrating things like psychedelic substances, things that don't appear to be addictive in nature, but that change brain connectivity, networking, information, activity expression in different ways. And perhaps this could be an uptake. So if the problem is the limited connectivity of certain networks of sensation, is there an antidote in actually using other types of non-addictive substances that can maybe recalibrate or assert those networks as a launching board for these types of therapies? So I think we're on our way there. They seem promising, and a real mixture of fields and a transdisciplinary look on what recovery might be. This could be other things. So it doesn't just have to be psychedelic use. I was wondering today about perhaps music therapies. Is there a way to use music and sound to elicit the types of attention we're looking for or that are necessary for these interoceptive activities that we're asking our clients to participate in? And art therapies and others. So these could all be baseline features of how to start where the client is and work from there into our more intensive programs. So I want to acknowledge our funder, the National Institutes on Drug Abuse, NNIAAA, and my co-principal investigator, Hortensia Morrow, our co-Is, John Monterosso with the imaging, Jimmy Hughes, statistician, Lei Duan, statistician, and so many wonderful people on our project site and our staff and our students and our research assistants that put so many great ideas together. And also to the study participants, the complexities in their life are so huge, and just really having the opportunity to work with them and see some future for alleviating suffering and helping them mitigate problems in their lives. I hope we were able to do that, and I hope we develop better programs for them. And thank you all today for sitting here with me. And let me open this up to questions now in our last 10 minutes.
I have allowed Susan to talk.
Hi. Hey, Susan.
Hello. I was just thinking about, my background is in occupational therapy and occupational science. So I was thinking about, as you were saying about engagement in music and other kinds of things as kind of a starting place into this deeper with mindfulness and meditation and things. And I was thinking about, it just made me wonder about, the power of engaging in occupations and meaningful activities of all sorts for each individual person. So it's not like prescribed, it's driven by the person themselves.
Yeah, I can imagine that. So I don't know too much about this field, but what I do know is as part of the residential treatment sites, vocational training could be a part of that whole milieu of services. So in terms of residential treatment and recovery, for sure, right? Because when they leave, they need to be stable, especially with many of our women going back to their families, and you don't want them unemployed, right? You want their children to have access to schools and health, and you want them to have the opportunity to work and cover the needs of their families. So 100%, I agree that if we're talking about returning to life with meaning, that has to be part of treatment. And I think it typically is. I didn't know if your point was addressing the additional element of, is there some way that occupational health or vocational training, if I'm even understanding those two things correctly, can serve to like boost response to a mindfulness program. So is that beyond, did I answer the first part and maybe we're going to the next stage of it, or did I miss the point?
Well, no, it's related. We're or adjacent at least. But occupation in the occupational therapy, occupational science realm, is occupation writ broadly of meaningful activity. So I was just thinking, as opposed to specific thing like music or some specific kind of modality or something, a more individually driven participation in something that's meaningful to the person, whatever it is, whatever kind of activity is meaningful to them, might be kind of like you were saying, kind of a gateway into this deeper, meditation and mindfulness and things.
That's true. And you wonder sometimes, people do need a sense of meaning, because in a group-based setting, you can get resistance sometime, and people would say, I don't see the connection, right? This is stupid. This is a waste of my time, because all they're seeing is a life of goal orientation, because they were used to external stimulus and their drive for it. So when you're asking people to sit and pay attention to all of the chaos that's going on right now inside, as we're trying to dampen that a little bit to get to a state of comfort, some people, there's really some resistance in the beginning. So maybe your model could be interesting in that if you set up like, here is the meaning by which we're doing this or for which we're doing it, it's because if you're seeking out this goal to be with your child, when we sit here and it appears that we're doing nothing, we're working deeply on ourselves. So when you return to your child, you can sit with them with a calmness, right? With a quietness, without the urge or itch to jump to the next thing as you're sitting there with your child, hanging out. So I can see some ways of it tying nicely. It kind of changes there's some fundamental elements here that some people may want to think about which would be, does a mindfulness program change its intent if we set up meaning making, right? Because then I think we're heading back to the cognitive behavioral domain. So as part of the treatment milieu, yeah. I don't know in terms of mindfulness training itself, if we can tie them together, but that's a good point.
Well, and even mindfulness itself could be seen as an occupation, in the meaningful kind of activity. So that one amongst whatever's meaningful to that person. I worked for a while in as an occupational therapist in mental health, and it just sometimes things that all kinds of therapies and things that people were resistant to, that sometimes those barriers would come down in the midst of engaging in something that they found pleasurable, that they found meaning in, and then maybe that's a kind of a sideways entrance into things, like maybe we can do some mindfulness while we're doing this particular activity or something.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think you got it. That really was intriguing. That the thing for its own right, practice for its own right, and practice for its own purpose. And I think tying into what you said to something, our gentle yoga activities, they're very pleasurable, right? So people can say, oh, I don't mind those because I kind of feel energized. It's getting me in like a space where I can feel my body and it's okay. So all of those can just be enjoyable activities over time. And I think that's why people do love the light yoga, especially our participants to start, because the activity itself is enjoyable without doing the more complex internal work that they're getting in their CBT type programming, and as well as more advanced stuff that we start doing in like session 3 and 4, where we go into the work, like the noticing of the discomfort, the surfing the urges, and you start getting the resistance there. It's not so pleasant. So we keep going back and forth. It's like, we'll get there. Okay, let's go back to what you're talking about, the meaning of just doing this and feeling good right now. So yeah, I like that point. It can just work in and out of the more complex things and then lighten it up with the doing things just for the purpose of doing them because they're enjoyable.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Okay, so if that is it, I think we're at our time. Thank you, everybody.